It happened on the night of Charleston's grandest gala, when the chandeliers sparkled and I watched the Ashfords. That was when Nathan Ashford, the heir everyone thought unshakable, did the unthinkable. Instead of honoring his family's legacy, he stepped forward, took the hand of a housemaid child, and declared before the city's elite, "This is the only family I need." In a world where money and bloodlines rule, what drives a man to risk everything for love that isn't bound by name or wealth? Before we dive in, let us know, what time are you listening to this? And where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Charleston had a way of carrying its past in plain sight. Old oaks lined the streets, their branches tangled with Spanish moss, casting shadows over rows of mansions that looked more like monuments than homes. Ashford Manor was one of those places, sitting back from the road with iron gates and wide verandas, grand but strangely hollow. People in town spoke of it as a landmark, though no one had been inside in years. Behind those tall windows lived Nathaniel Ashford. On paper, he was a wealthy man, real estate investments scattered across the South, his name attached to properties most people would never step foot in. Yet anyone who'd met him in the last decade would say the same thing. Nathan had pulled himself out of the world and locked the door behind him. He spent his days at a heavy oak desk, moving numbers across pages, signing contracts, and pretending it was all that mattered. The silence inside the house was thick, like it had settled there on purpose. He ate alone, read alone, and walked the corridors alone. Servants came and went quietly, hired to maintain order, never to disturb. That was how he wanted it. At least, that was the story he told himself. There had been a time when laughter lived inside these walls, the quick patter of small feet echoing on the polished floors. That ended the night his daughter was taken from him. The accident had been years ago, but Nathan lived as if it had just happened last week. He carried the weight like a stone lodged in his chest. Grief had hardened into ritual, and ritual became his only protection. He created rules, rigid, unspoken laws that everyone under his roof learned fast. No sudden changes. No unexpected visitors. No one touched the east wing, where the light barely reached and dust floated like quiet reminders. At the end of that wing was a door. Behind it, the child's bedroom remained untouched. Toys in their places. Books lined neatly on the shelves. Curtains drawn the way she left them. Nathan kept the key with him always, a constant reminder that some rooms were not meant to be disturbed. He told himself it was about respect, about memory. But the truth was simpler and crueler. If he let anyone into that room, he feared the last thread connecting him to his daughter would snap. Losing her once had nearly destroyed him. Losing her again, by allowing the space to change, felt unbearable. So he lived as a man of order and distance. From the outside, he looked polished, controlled, untouchable. Inside, he was split down the middle, half clinging to discipline, half broken by emptiness. And though he would never admit it aloud, Nathaniel Ashford's greatest fear was not the silence around him. It was the possibility that someone might find a way to break it. The first time Marisol Vega stepped through the tall doors of Ashford Manor, she carried the look of someone determined not to stumble. She kept her shoulders straight, her dark hair tied back, and her little girl's hand firmly in hers. Lila, only 6, skipped beside her, tugging against her mother's grip with wide-eyed curiosity. The house loomed overhead, bigger than any place she had ever been allowed inside, and Lila whispered, as if she were entering a museum. Nathan Ashford hardly glanced at them when they arrived. He gave quick instructions, clipped and final, his eyes never settling for long. The rules were laid out the way someone might recite a grocery list, except there was no softness in his tone. No noise after 8. Meals are served precisely at set times. Don't touch anything you don't need to. And he paused, his voice dipping into something heavier. No one goes upstairs, especially the East Wing. Marisol nodded quickly, repeating "Yes, sir," in a voice that tried to mask her unease. She had worked in fine homes before, but this was different. The air felt charged, like the walls themselves were listening. Days passed quietly. Marisol kept to her work, scrubbing the wide staircases, polishing silver that never seemed to be used. Lila spent her hours coloring in a small corner of the kitchen, humming to herself. The silence of the house pressed on them both. Even laughter felt dangerous here. One afternoon, rain swept across Charleston, filling the sky with a gray weight. Thunder rumbled, shaking the shutters. Marisol was busy folding linens when she noticed the kitchen chair was empty. Panic rippled through her chest. She called out softly, not daring to raise her voice in this house. "Lila, where are you?" She hurried down the hallway, her footsteps quick on the marble floor. That was when she saw the faintest glow of light spilling from a door at the far end of the east wing. The forbidden wing. Marisol's stomach dropped. Inside the room, Lila stood on tiptoe, her damp shoes leaving faint marks on the wood. Her little hands carefully placed a worn teddy bear on the bed, next to a pillow that looked untouched for years. The room smelled faintly of lavender, though time had dulled it. Toys lined the shelves, dust settled over the books, and a dollhouse waited as if for a child who had just stepped out for a moment. Lila whispered to herself, "I think she'll like this one. It helps me sleep." She smoothed the teddy bear's ear, the innocent gesture of a child trying to share comfort. Marisol's heart pounded as she darted inside. She grabbed her daughter by the shoulders, pulling her back. "Lila, you can't be here. We're not supposed to." Her words froze in her throat. Nathan was standing in the doorway. His figure filled the frame, dark suit against the pale wallpaper. His face was carved in stone, but his eyes betrayed him. They flicked from Marisol's frantic hands to the small bear resting on the blanket. For a long moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Marisol braced herself for the explosion. She could already imagine his words, the dismissal, the cold finality of being cast out. She whispered, "I'm so sorry, Mr. Ashford." She didn't mean any harm. But Nathan said nothing. He didn't move. He simply looked at the teddy bear, the same way a man might look at something he had lost a long time ago and never thought he'd see again. His jaw tightened, yet his eyes wavered, unsteady. Marisol waited, trembling, until the silence became unbearable. She lowered her gaze, guiding Lila past him, her breath shallow as they slipped from the room. Nathan remained where he was, one hand pressed lightly against the doorframe. The rain tapped harder against the windows, drowning the house in sound. His eyes stayed on the small bear, the bright patch of life that didn't belong to this frozen shrine. For years, the East Wing had been sealed behind ritual and grief, guarded like sacred ground. But now a single act of innocence had slipped past his defenses. A child's gift, offered without knowing the weight of memory, had cracked the walls he'd built. Down the hall, Marisol whispered to her daughter in a trembling voice, "Promise me you'll never wander again. Do you hear me?" Lila nodded, still wide-eyed, unable to understand why her mother's voice shook so much. To her, it was just a bedroom. To Nathan, it was the one place time had stopped. And standing in that doorway, watching the teddy bear settle into its new place, Nathan Ashford felt something stir, something he thought he had buried for good. He wouldn't admit it, not even to himself, but the silence inside him had just been disturbed. Nathan's order came quickly after the intrusion. By the next morning, the teddy bear was gone from the bed, the curtains were drawn just as they had always been, and the air in that room returned to its frozen stillness. He told the staff, with a tone that brooked no hesitation, "Everything stays as it was. No exceptions." But the command did nothing to quiet his mind. That night, the rain had passed, leaving a heavy silence, and still he could not sleep. He tossed in his sheets, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts circling back to the small figure of Lila, standing in that forbidden place, offering something that was both ordinary and devastating. He could see her tiny hand setting the bear down, hear the soft words she had spoken. Long after midnight, he rose. The house creaked with its age, and the polished floors reflected slivers of moonlight as he walked. His steps carried him toward the east wing almost against his will. He stopped in front of the closed door. His hand lifted, hesitated, then pressed against the cool brass of the knob. It trembled there, as if the door itself might burn him. For years, he had avoided this exact moment. Keeping that room sealed was a way of keeping control. If it stayed untouched, then her memory stayed intact, suspended in amber. But now, with one small bear, a child had broken the barrier. And Nathan wasn't certain whether he wanted it restored. He stood there so long that the night seemed to stretch endlessly, shadows shifting across the hall. His chest tightened with two opposing desires: lock the grief away forever, or let in the smallest sliver of life again. He finally dropped his hand, retreating like a man who had nearly touched fire. The following afternoon, while he was at his desk, surrounded by papers he could barely focus on, the door burst open without warning. Lila came running in, her hair still damp from playing outside. In her hand was a piece of paper covered in uneven strokes of crayon. She stopped in front of him, smiling, and placed it squarely on the desk. "I drew this for you," she said. He looked down. The picture was simple: lines for walls, squares for windows, a bright yellow circle that was supposed to be the sun. But what caught him off guard was the way she had filled the house with light. Rays of gold and orange spilled from every side. He cleared his throat, trying to steady himself. "What is this supposed to be?" His tone came out harsher than he intended. "A house," she replied, as if it were the most obvious thing. "But not dark. See? This one has light inside. So you don't have to be sad anymore." Nathan froze. For a moment, he couldn't find words. The blunt innocence of it pierced deeper than any accusation could. He picked up the paper, studied the messy lines, then set it back down. "You shouldn't come barging in here," he muttered, his voice low. "This is not a place to play." Lila only tilted her head. "It's not playing. It's a gift." Then she skipped out again, humming softly as though nothing had been broken between them. Nathan sat motionless. His fingers lingered on the corner of the drawing, as though part of him wanted to hold on, while another part wanted to shove it into a drawer and forget. The tightness in his chest was back, pressing harder. That evening, when he finally pushed the papers aside, his eyes fell once more on the drawing. It was clumsy, childish, uneven, but it had managed to do what years of silence could not. It unsettled him. Nathan leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, the sound of Lila's small voice echoing in his memory. "So you don't have to be sad anymore." For the first time in a very long time, he admitted to himself, quietly, reluctantly, that the sadness was still there, and perhaps he was no longer able to keep it locked away. Yet even with that realization, pride forced him to push the thought aside. He told himself it meant nothing, just a child's nonsense. But deep down, Nathan knew better. The wall he had built around his grief had begun to crack. Marisol had been inside Ashford Manor long enough to understand its rhythm. Quiet mornings broken only by the ticking of clocks, afternoons filled with polishing and folding, and evenings that ended in silence heavy enough to press on her chest. She took her duties seriously, never once sitting where she wasn't told or leaving a mark where she shouldn't. Nathan's rules were strict, but she clung to them because they gave her and her daughter a fragile place here. Every night, when she tucked Lila into a narrow bed in the small servants' quarters, she whispered promises. "We'll get by. We just have to be careful." Lila would nod sleepily, clutching the same worn teddy bear she had once tried to give away. Marisol carried the fear in her stomach like a stone, that one wrong move could send them both out the door. To keep food on the table, Marisol also worked early shifts at Harbor Light Cafe, a small diner near the waterfront. She'd come home smelling faintly of coffee and fried eggs, then change into a crisp uniform before beginning her second round of work at the manor. She was exhausted most of the time, but she never let Nathan see it. Pride wouldn't allow her to appear weak in front of a man who seemed to judge her every move. Nathan remained cold and distant, his words clipped, his glances sharp. To him, she was staff, useful, so long as she stayed in her place. She never expected kindness from him, and he never offered any. The gulf between them felt fixed. But the real shift came the day Eleanor Ashford returned. The air in the house changed the moment the front doors opened, and her heels clicked across the marble floor. She carried herself with the authority of someone who had never once been challenged, every movement deliberate. her chin tilted as if to remind the world who she was. When Eleanor's eyes fell on Marisol and Lila, her expression tightened. She looked at them not as people, but as an intrusion. "And who are these?" she asked, her voice carrying a polished edge that cut through the hall. Marisol lowered her gaze. "I'm Marisol Vega, ma'am. I manage the household now. This is my daughter, Lila." Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. "A child? In this house?" She turned sharply toward Nathan, who had just entered the room. "You allow this?" Before Nathan could answer, Lila stepped forward, all innocence and curiosity. "Hello," she said brightly, her small voice echoing in the vast space. "Are you Mr. Nathan's mama?" The question drew a hush across the room. Marisol's heart nearly stopped. She wanted to scoop Lila up and disappear. But Eleanor simply arched an eyebrow, looking down at the little girl, as though she were something spilled on the carpet. "Yes," Eleanor said coolly. "I am his mother. And who might you be?" "I'm Lila," the girl replied, smiling as if introductions solved everything. "I brought my teddy bear upstairs once. I thought maybe the little girl who lived here before would like it." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Marisol froze, wishing desperately she could undo her daughter's words. Nathan's jaw tightened, his hands curling at his sides. His mother's eyes flicked to him. Her voice softened, though it carried something raw beneath. If she had lived, she'd be about this one's age now. The remark hung in the air like a bell, tolling. Marisol felt the weight of it, though she didn't fully understand. Lila tilted her head, sensing the shift, but too young to grasp its meaning. Nathan stood still, as if rooted to the floor. He had spent years avoiding such words, avoiding the thought of measuring his daughter against the passing of time. Hearing his mother speak it aloud cracked something in him that he wasn't prepared for. He could not speak. He only turned away, his face unreadable. Marisol guided Lila back a step, whispering, "Stay quiet now." The child obeyed reluctantly, sensing her mother's tension. Eleanor broke the silence with a sharp tone. "This is not a place for sentiment. A servant and her child do not belong in Ashford Manor. I expect this corrected, Nathan." Marisol kept her head bowed, but her cheeks burned with humiliation. She didn't argue. She couldn't afford to. Lila clung to her side, confused by the chill in the woman's words. As Eleanor swept past, the echo of her heels followed her up the stairs. The grand house seemed colder in her wake. Nathan lingered at the bottom step, caught between two worlds. The ghost of a daughter he couldn't let go of, and the living child who had just reminded him of her. His mother's disdain only deepened the conflict tearing inside him. For Marisol and Lila, the walls of Ashford Manor felt suddenly more fragile, their place in it uncertain. For Nathan, the return of Eleanor made his solitude no longer safe. Memory and reality were colliding, and he could no longer control which would prevail. Life inside Ashford Manor grew tighter once Eleanor re-established herself as the matriarch. She moved through the house with the air of someone reclaiming lost territory, her voice carrying across rooms, her instructions sharp as if she were issuing commands in a courtroom. Within days, rules multiplied. Marisol was told which halls she could clean and which she was to leave untouched. Lila was warned not to linger near the grand staircase or wander into the gardens without permission. What had once felt like a cold but steady place now seemed suffocating. Eleanor's disapproval of Marisol was no longer subtle. At dinner one evening, she leaned toward Nathan with her glass of wine raised and said, in a tone just loud enough for Marisol to hear, "This house deserves proper stewardship. A trained housekeeper, someone with discretion and polish. Not a woman who divides her hours between menial jobs." Marisol lowered her eyes, her hands tightening on the serving tray. She said nothing, because anything she said might cost her position. But the sting was there, visible in the flush rising across her cheeks. Nathan sat stiff in his chair. For years, silence had been his shield, the way he survived both grief and his mother's dominance. Tonight, though, silence tasted bitter. His gaze drifted to the staircase where earlier that afternoon he had found Lila sitting by herself, legs tucked under her, The teddy bear hugged so close to her chest it looked like she was holding on for dear life. She hadn't spoken when he walked past. She had just watched him with those wide, questioning eyes, as if asking what she had done wrong to deserve the new rules. That image clung to him now, stronger than his mother's pointed words. Eleanor continued, her voice cool. This is not a home for charity cases, Nathan. You may think you're helping them, but in truth, you're allowing disorder. The Ashford name demands more. Nathan's jaw tightened. He set his fork down, the clink against china louder than intended. His voice, when it came, was edged with something rarely heard from him, anger. Is that what you call it, Mother? Disorder? A little girl sitting quietly with a toy in her lap. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. Don't twist my words. I am safeguarding what your father and generations before him built. This house, this name, it is not a place to test emotions. It is a legacy, and legacies are fragile when treated carelessly. Nathan pushed back his chair. The scrape against the floor cut through the room like a blade. He stood tall, his face pale but set. What's fragile isn't the name. It's me. And I won't let you treat them like they're dirt on the floor. The room fell silent. Even the faint clatter of dishes from the kitchen stopped, as if the staff knew something had shifted. Eleanor's expression hardened, but she said nothing more. Her silence was not surrender, it was a warning. Marisol, standing by with the tray, dared not look up, but she felt the current passing between mother and son. It was sharp, electric, the kind of clash that left no room for retreat. Lila, oblivious to the storm gathering, had already fallen asleep in her small bed, hugging her bear, unaware she had become the center of a war neither she nor her mother had asked for. Nathan left the dining room before dessert was served, his steps echoing in the cavernous hall. He didn't stop until he reached his study, where he closed the door with a firmness that carried all the weight of his unspoken defiance. For years, he had yielded to his mother's authority. Tonight had shown him there was a line he could no longer allow her to cross. Still, he wasn't ready to dismantle her control outright. He sat at his desk, staring at the crayon drawing Lila had given him days earlier, the one of the house filled with light. His anger cooled into something more complicated. Fear, longing, determination twisted together. The battle had begun, though no words could rewind what had been said. And Nathan knew, perhaps, that he and his mother were heading toward a collision no one could stop. Charleston summer evenings had a way of turning every event into a performance. Lanterns glowed along Ravenhurst Hall, the grand estate perched on the edge of town. The wide lawn was dotted with white tents, strings of lights draped between them like threads of gold. Carriages had long since given way to polished black cars, and one after another they pulled up the drive, spilling out guests in gowns and suits that glimmered under the soft light. Nathan had never cared for these affairs. They were exercises in reputation, not community. Still, when Eleanor announced the Ashfords' presence was required, there was little room to refuse. He found himself in the back seat of the car, staring out the window, letting his mother's carefully chosen words wash over him. It is vital, she reminded, that people see we remain untarnished. Do not invite gossip. Stand tall, smile politely, and let me handle what needs handling. Inside the hall, the noise was a constant swell of conversation, laughter, and the clink of glasses. Nathan drifted near the edges, offering nods to acquaintances, but rarely speaking more than a few words. He could feel his mother's presence everywhere, guiding the evening like a conductor. He didn't expect to see Marisol, but there she was, moving quietly among the crowd in the crisp uniform of a catering assistant, carrying trays of sparkling water and hors d'oeuvres. She didn't notice him at first, her attention fixed on balancing the weight in her hands. Lila had been left in the care of another staff member near the kitchen, but children had a way of slipping past barriers. It was later in the night, when the speeches had begun and Eleanor stood near the stage, that the commotion started. A ripple of whispers spread as a small figure appeared among the rows of guests. Lila, cheeks flushed from wandering, clutched her teddy bear in one arm and looked around as if the sea of gowns and tuxedos had swallowed her whole. A woman near the front, draped in emerald silk and pearls, spotted her first. Her laughter rang out, sharp enough to draw every eye. "And who is this little darling?" "An Ashford heir we haven't met." The word struck like a stone tossed into still water. Heads turned, murmurs grew, and soon the entire hall seemed to be watching. Lila froze, her wide eyes darting to Nathan. Eleanor stepped forward, her smile brittle, her voice cutting through the noise. "This child is no Ashford," she declared. "She's simply the daughter of the help." The hush that followed was brutal. Lila's face fell, the teddy bear clutched tighter against her chest. Her gaze flicked once more to Nathan, as if waiting for him to say something, anything, to pull her out of the humiliation that hung in the air. Nathan felt every heartbeat like a hammer inside his ribs. He could speak. He could step forward, put an end to the sneers, and claim the truth that had been gnawing at him for weeks, that this child, in her small, unassuming way, had already breathed life into the hollow corners of his world. But the weight of his mother's warning pressed down like iron. His tongue stayed still. He did nothing. Marisol rushed in, pulling Lila gently back toward the kitchen, her face tight with both shame and fury. The guests returned to their champagne and chatter, but the wound remained, etched on the small girl's expression as she disappeared behind the swinging doors. Nathan stood rooted, hands clenched at his sides, his jaw locked. He told himself he was protecting the family name, maintaining order, doing what was expected. But deep inside, he knew he had chosen the coward's path. When the evening finally ended and the last car rolled away, he returned to Ashford Manor in silence. The house seemed even larger, emptier than before. He walked the halls alone, the image of Lila's eyes, hurt, confused, asking why he had abandoned her, burning into him. Lying awake that night, staring into the dark, Nathan realized there was no refuge left in his old defenses. His silence had wounded a child who had only ever offered him kindness. The shame was heavier than grief, heavier than legacy. And Nathan understood that if he wanted to live as more than a shell, he would have to choose differently. He could no longer hide behind his mother's voice or the Ashford name. He had reached a line he could not cross again. After Ravenhurst Hall, the house seemed heavier than ever. Silence no longer protected Nathan, it accused him. Every corner of Ashford Manor carried the echo of that night, the laughter in the ballroom, Eleanor's cold dismissal, and above all, the look in Lila's eyes when he chose not to speak. It haunted him in the stillness, gnawed at him even when he tried to bury himself in work. Marisol moved through her duties with a strained quiet. She avoided Nathan's gaze whenever possible, her back straighter, her voice clipped. He could feel the distance she was building, brick by brick. What stung most was that she was right to build it. His silence had betrayed them both. One afternoon, as sunlight streamed through tall windows, Nathan overheard voices in the courtyard below. Marisol and Lila sat on a bench, the little girl swinging her legs as her mother brushed tangles from her hair. Marisol's voice was soft but firm. "We can't stay here, Mija. It's not safe. I won't have you looked at like that again." Lila shook her head so hard the brush slipped from her hair. "No, we can't leave. He needs me." Marisol sighed. "He doesn't need us. He has his world, and we have ours." The child turned stubborn, her voice clear in the quiet air. "If we go, he'll be lonely again. I don't want him to be lonely." Nathan stepped back from the window, heart tight. He shouldn't have listened, but the words pierced deeper than anything his mother had said. He was ashamed of how badly he wanted them to be true. A few nights later, he did something he hadn't planned. Instead of retreating home after a meeting, Nathan walked the narrow streets of the Harbor District. Lights glowed warm in shop windows, laughter spilled from doorways, and the air smelled of salt and fried food. He hadn't been down here in years. It felt like another world, one his wealth had insulated him from. That was when he saw her. Through the front window of Harbor Light Cafe, Marisol was clearing plates, her shoulders slumped, fatigue visible in the way she moved. The place was simple, red vinyl booths, a chalkboard menu, the smell of strong coffee and butter clinging to the air. She balanced a tray with one hand, wiping crumbs from a table with the other, while a cook shouted orders from the back. Nathan stood outside longer than he should have, watching. Marisol was not just a servant in his house. She was a woman working 2 jobs, carrying responsibility without complaint, making sure her child had what she needed. He wondered how many times she had swallowed her pride to keep food on the table. When Lila came through the door after school, her backpack nearly tipping her over, Marisol's whole face changed. Tired lines softened. She crouched to hug the girl, listening intently as Lila chattered about her day. The sight twisted something inside Nathan. It wasn't grand or dramatic, it was ordinary. And maybe that was why it struck so hard. For years he had lived among ghosts, clinging to what was lost. But here, in the glow of a small-town diner, he saw what it meant to live in the present. Love expressed through small gestures, comfort found in routine, hope in a child's laugh. He went inside, quietly, sliding into a booth near the door. Marisol glanced up, startled, but said nothing. He didn't explain himself, didn't know how. He simply sat, drinking black coffee, pretending he had some right to be there. When the meal was over, he rose and walked to the counter. Before she could protest, he laid a bill down to cover their dinner. For them, he said simply, nodding toward Marisol and Lila. Marisol looked at him with a mix of suspicion and confusion, but there was something else in her eyes too, something that told him she saw through his reserve. He left without another word, stepping into the Charleston night. The streets smelled of rain, the harbor breeze tugging at his coat. Nathan didn't feel entirely like a man drifting alone in his grief. Eleanor had always known when something in the house began to shift. Nathan could hold his tongue, withdraw into his papers, or busy himself with estate matters, but she noticed the smallest signs. The softer way his gaze lingered when Lila skipped through the hall, the quiet patience he now showed Marisol, even the nights he came to dinner instead of hiding in his study. It did not take long before she confronted him. It was morning, pale light pouring through the dining room windows. Eleanor sat straight-backed at the head of the table, her tea untouched, her eyes sharp. Nathan had barely set down his coffee when she spoke. "Tell me the truth," she began, her voice cutting through the stillness. "Are you truly planning to drag this family name through the mud for the sake of a servant and her child?" Nathan's jaw tightened. He had heard accusations before, but this time something in him refused to retreat. He met her gaze. "Marisol isn't just a servant. And Lila," he paused, the words heavier than he expected. "Lila isn't just anyone's child." Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. "Do you hear yourself? A man with your standing. An Ashford lowering himself? Charleston society will devour you. They will not forgive it." "I don't care what Charleston thinks," Nathan said, surprising even himself with the firmness in his tone. "What I care about is that little girl's happiness." But then Eleanor delivered the blow she always knew would cut deepest. She leaned forward, her eyes piercing. "And what of the Ashford legacy? What of your daughter's memory? Will you throw all of it away for a fleeting distraction?" The silence that followed was unbearable. Nathan's hand curled around the edge of his chair. He wanted to shout, to tell her she was wrong. But the truth was, he didn't know. The fear of losing again, of burying another piece of his heart, clamped down on his voice. And so he stayed silent. Marisol noticed the distance immediately. She was polite, respectful, but her words were shorter now, her presence more guarded. At night, she lingered near Lila's room instead of sitting in the kitchen as she once did. There was a new resignation in her eyes, as though she had already decided Nathan could not withstand his mother's world. Nathan felt the weight of that unspoken judgment every time she passed him in the hall. He wanted to stop her, to tell her he wasn't as weak as he seemed. Yet every time he tried, the old fear whispered, what if they leave? What if tragedy strikes again? Could he survive it twice? The question gnawed at him until one evening. Fate answered it in a way he hadn't expected. He had been in the library, Eleanor's words echoing still, when a small figure lingered in the doorway. Lila stood there, clutching her ever-present stuffed bear, her eyes wide and solemn. "I heard you," she said softly. Nathan's breath caught. "Heard me?" "You and your mom," Lila explained. the innocence in her tone making the words heavier. She said, "We don't belong here. And you didn't say no." Nathan opened his mouth, but no explanation came. The child's gaze didn't waver. "Are you going to let us go?" she asked, her voice trembling only slightly. "Like people left you?" The words cut clean through him. All the careful walls he had built, walls of silence, rules, and control, cracked under the force of her question. In that moment he saw her not just as a child, but as the mirror of everything he had lost and everything he still feared to lose. He knelt slowly, his chest tight. "Lila," he wanted to promise, to swear he would never let her go, but his throat closed on the words. The truth was, he didn't know if he had that strength. Her eyes searched his face, waiting. The bear dangled from her arm, its fur worn thin from being held so tightly. Nathan realized then that the decision he had avoided for so long was no longer about him. It wasn't about reputation or legacy or even grief. It was about this little girl standing in front of him, asking a question only he could answer. When she finally turned and padded back down the hall, Nathan remained frozen, her words echoing in his mind. "Will you let us go, like they left you?" Summer in Charleston had a way of pressing down on everything. Air, skin, even the soul. By the time the annual Ashford Charity Gala arrived, the magnolias around the estate hung heavy with scent, and the humidity wrapped itself around guests' silk gowns and black suits. Ashford Manor glittered that night. Lanterns swayed from the oaks, the fountain in the courtyard spilled silver light, and a string quartet played as if their bows alone held the weight of tradition. For Eleanor, the evening was more than charity. It was a stage. She had spent weeks orchestrating not just the guest list, but the message. Every detail reminded the city that the Ashfords were not simply another wealthy family. They were legacy. And legacies could not afford shadows, let alone scandal. Marisol moved quietly among the servers in her crisp uniform, balancing trays of champagne flutes. She had been asked to step in for the caterer, an extra hand for the evening, they had said, but she could sense the undertone. She was being paraded, her presence tolerated just long enough to serve, then dismissed. Lila waited in the kitchen with the staff's children, a place Eleanor thought more suitable. Nathan lingered upstairs longer than he should have, pacing. His study no longer held him, so his steps carried him into the room he both feared and cherished most, his daughter's bedroom. The pale wallpaper, still untouched, carried faint imprints of a life that once filled it with laughter. He stood before the small dresser, fingertips brushing over a photograph in its frame, a girl with curls and a smile wide enough to shame the sun. In the quiet, Eleanor's plan echoed in his mind. She intended to dismiss Marisol at the end of the night, not privately, but as a statement. Nathan could already hear the polite murmurs, the carefully veiled satisfaction of Charleston's elite. They would nod, sip their champagne, and say the Ashfords corrected their mistake. But then came Lila's face in his memory, how she looked at him days ago, eyes filled with trust and that small, piercing question, "Will you let us go, like they left you?" Nathan's chest tightened. He felt trapped between two ghosts, his daughter's memory pulling him backward, and Lila's presence tugging him forward. Which path was betrayal? To protect the Ashford name by letting go, or to risk everything for a new bond that might break him all over again? By the time he descended the staircase, the gala was in full bloom. Crystal glasses chimed, laughter spilled across the marble floors, and conversations about politics, stocks, and art drifted like smoke through the air. Nathan carried his usual armor, a cold expression, impeccable suit, and silence. People admired from afar, but rarely approached. He had long made sure of that. Yet whispers traveled faster than music. He caught them in passing. "Did you hear? The housekeeper's child has been running about the manor. Ashford legacy at risk, unthinkable. They say Nathan has grown soft." Each comment sliced sharper than he expected. He had lived his life ignoring Charleston's talk, but tonight it felt personal. It wasn't just his reputation. It was Lila they dissected like a rumor, as if her small hands and innocent smile could unravel the threads of Ashford pride. Across the room, Eleanor moved gracefully among her circle, her pearls catching the chandelier light. When she caught Nathan's eye, Her expression carried victory already won. He knew her intentions would unfold soon, with a precision only she could master. Nathan's gaze swept toward the hallway, where servers came and went. He caught a glimpse of Marisol balancing another tray, her posture straight despite the strain, her eyes lowered to avoid judgmental stares. He wondered what strength it took to carry not only the weight of glasses, but the dignity of someone determined not to break. And beneath all of it, the storm inside him raged. His daughter's photo haunted him. Lila's trust pressed against his chest like fire, and his mother's voice, unyielding, commanding, coiled around him like chains. When the string quartet shifted into a waltz and couples began to fill the dance floor, Nathan stood near the grand fireplace, unmoving. He could feel eyes on him, waiting to see which way he would turn. Would he stand with his mother, the eternal Ashford heir, or with the child who had dared to breathe life into his silence? The decision did not come. Not yet. Instead, Nathan let the mask settle back over his face. Cold. Composed. A man who revealed nothing. But inside, the battle clawed at him, tearing him in two. Tonight would not end quietly. He knew Eleanor's hand would fall, sharp and public. And when it did, he would have to choose, not tomorrow, not someday, but in that very moment. As the night deepened and laughter swelled, Nathan's figure at the edge of the ballroom seemed almost statuesque. To the guests, he was the Ashford they expected. Stern, untouchable, unmoved. The ballroom glowed beneath the chandeliers, their light refracting off glass and silver as though the Ashfords themselves had bottled elegance and put on display. Voices mingled, laughter lifted, and every guest knew they were part of Charleston's most exclusive evening. For Eleanor, this was her domain, a stage where she could remind the world who the Ashfords were and what they represented. When the string quartet finished a polished movement, Eleanor rose gracefully, her gown trailing behind her like a wave. She tapped her glass with a silver spoon, and silence fell quickly. She had that kind of presence, the kind that made people lean in, afraid to miss a word. "My friends," she began, her voice warm but firm, "tonight we gather not only for charity, but to honor something greater, heritage. The Ashford family has stood for centuries as a symbol of endurance, propriety, and most importantly, dignity." Polite applause rippled through the room. Nathan stood near the edge of the crowd, his jaw set, every word from her mouth landing like a stone in his chest. He knew what was coming. Eleanor's eyes swept the room, pausing deliberately where Marisol stood with a tray in hand. "But heritage," she continued, "is fragile. It requires care. It requires boundaries. And it requires that we not blur the lines between duty and sentiment. For that reason, I must clarify, what some may have mistaken as change was simply a misstep. And tonight we correct it." The words hung in the air like a blade. Gasps fluttered through the crowd. Marisol froze mid-step, the tray trembling in her hands. Lila, standing near the back, clutched her mother's fingers so tightly her knuckles whitened. Nathan's chest burned. For weeks he had wrestled in silence, but seeing Lila's wide, frightened eyes broke something inside him. He could no longer stand in the shadows, while his mother gutted the only light he had left. Without waiting for his mind to catch up, Nathan moved. He stepped onto the platform beside Eleanor, startling her mid-sentence. The crowd murmured. Eleanor's expression stiffened, her smile cracking. Nathan didn't look at her. He reached into the audience and extended his hand. "Lila," he called softly. The little girl hesitated, then slipped her hand into his, eyes brimming with confusion and hope. The room grew utterly still. Nathan lifted her onto the stage, holding her hand tightly. He turned toward the crowd, his voice steady though his heart pounded. "This house," he said, glancing at the gilded walls and marble floors, "has been nothing more than a tomb. It has carried silence, grief, and the weight of memories that nearly crushed me. But this child," he rested his hand gently on Lila's shoulder. "She brought life back here. She gave it laughter, warmth, and a heartbeat." A hush fell deeper. Eleanor's pearl necklace glimmered as she stiffened, her lips parting in disbelief. "I don't need legacy," Nathan continued. I don't need the Ashford name to mean something to Charleston. What I need, what I've finally found, is family. The word struck like thunder. Some guests gasped. A woman in a sequined dress whispered to her husband, "He's ruined himself." But across the room, others dabbed at their eyes, visibly moved. A man near the back muttered, "About time someone spoke from the heart." Nathan bent slightly, scooping Lila into his arms. The child rested her head against his shoulder, her small fingers curling into the lapel of his suit as if she had been waiting all along for that moment of belonging. "You see," Nathan said quietly, though every ear caught his words, "heritage means nothing if it costs us our humanity." The ballroom erupted, not into applause, not into silence, but into chaos. Voices clashed. Some accused. Some defended. The air buzzed with shock, judgment, admiration. Eleanor's face blazed. She stepped forward, her voice icy. "You shame us all. You shame your father's name, your ancestors, everything this house stands for." Nathan turned to her, his voice calm but resolute. "No, Mother. I'm honoring them. By choosing life over ghosts." The room gasped again. For Eleanor, the moment was betrayal, public, raw, and irreversible. The bond between mother and son, already frayed, now tore completely. She stepped back, her composure slipping. Marisol stood frozen near the servants' entrance, tears welling but refusing to fall. She had expected humiliation, perhaps dismissal, but not this. Not Nathan, standing tall, holding her daughter as if she were his own, and declaring before Charleston's elite that he had chosen them. The orchestra sat idle, bows resting on strings, waiting for a cue that would never come. The air had shifted. Nothing about the evening or the Ashfords would ever be the same. As Nathan stepped down from the stage, Lila still in his arms, the crowd parted instinctively. Some turned their backs. Others reached out, whispering blessings. But Nathan didn't meet their eyes. His gaze stayed forward, steady, as though he had already made peace with what came next. The morning after the gala, Charleston was buzzing. Newspapers splashed headlines with Nathan's name, some calling his stand a brave rejection of cold tradition, others mocking him for tarnishing one of the city's most respected lineages. At cafes along King Street, whispers turned into debates. Was he a man of principle, or just another fallen Ashford letting grief dictate his choices? Inside Ashford Manor, the tension thickened until even the air seemed unwilling to move. Eleanor requested to see Nathan in the study, a room that had belonged to his father, with oak-paneled walls that seemed to remember every stern conversation that had ever happened inside. She didn't waste time. "Nathan," she began, voice clipped, "this cannot continue. Last night was a disgrace, but I am willing to give you one final chance to remember who you are." Nathan stood by the tall window, his hands tucked into his pockets, staring out at the garden where summer roses struggled in the heat. He didn't answer right away. Eleanor pressed on. "You will sever ties with that woman and her child. Immediately. If you refuse, you will be cut out of every trust, every property, every board seat. Ashford will not be humiliated under my watch." Her words were precise, polished like stones she had sharpened in her mouth. Nathan turned slowly, his face unreadable. "So it's them or everything else." "It's not a choice," Eleanor snapped. "It's survival. You can rebuild your personal life quietly, but publicly, you will not dismantle generations of dignity." For a moment, Nathan thought of all the things those walls had seen: lavish dinners, board meetings, endless lectures on how to maintain the Ashford standard. But never laughter. Never the sound of a child running through the hall without fear of being hushed. He left the study without replying. That night, he wandered through the house, sleepless, pulled by a familiar ache. His feet led him into the room that once belonged to his daughter. The wallpaper still carried faint marks where she had taped up her drawings. On the dresser stood a photograph, her smile frozen in time, radiant and unknowing of what would come. Nathan sat heavily on the bed, the silence pressing against him. His throat tightened. He whispered into the stillness, as though she might answer. "I let you slip away. I let the house decide what mattered. And all I have left is regret. His fingers brushed the frame of the picture. But I won't make the same mistake twice. I can't watch another child walk out of my life just because I was too afraid. When dawn filtered in, pale and gray, Nathan felt his decision settle like a stone, not crushing, but grounding. He had chosen. Later that day, when he found Marisol in the kitchen, she was packing quietly, her movements stiff with determination. "We'll be out of here before dinner," she said, without looking at him. "You don't need more trouble." "Marisol," Nathan said softly, "you're not leaving. Not like this." She turned, eyes blazing with a mix of pride and hurt. "You don't understand. Your mother is right about one thing. We don't belong in your world. And I won't have Lila growing up under constant humiliation." Nathan stepped closer, steady. "I do understand. I know what humiliation feels like, what loss does. And I won't let either of you carry it alone. I told my mother I would choose you. And I have." Marisol shook her head, disbelief shadowing her face. "You'd throw away everything? For us?" "I already did," Nathan said. His voice cracked, but his eyes didn't waver. "The moment I let Lila walk into my heart, there was no going back. The Ashford name, the fortune, the endless parties, they mean nothing to me anymore." It was Lila who broke the silence. She had been standing in the doorway, her backpack dangling off one shoulder. She walked over, slipping her small hand into Nathan's. Her voice was soft but sure. "So, you've chosen to stay, haven't you?" Nathan knelt so his eyes were level with hers. He searched her face, the way her innocence carried a strength he hadn't found in himself until now. "Yes," he whispered. "I'm staying." Lila smiled, the kind of smile that reached her eyes and seemed to light the dim room. For Nathan, it felt like forgiveness and promise all at once. Marisol pressed a hand to her mouth, torn between fear and something that felt dangerously like hope. "Nathan, this isn't easy," she murmured. "I know," he said. "But family never is. And that's what we are now, if you'll let me." No contract, no inheritance, no Ashford decree could define what had just been spoken aloud. Nathan wasn't carrying his father's name or his mother's expectations. He was carrying his own truth. That evening, as the sun sank over Charleston, Nathan closed the heavy doors of Ashford Manor behind him. He wasn't leaving the house forever, not yet. But he was stepping out from under its shadow. The choice had been made, wealth and reputation on one side, or love and belonging on the other. He had chosen, and he would keep choosing, no matter the cost. By the end of that week, Charleston felt like it had only one subject to discuss: the Ashfords. Newspapers carried Eleanor's carefully worded statement, and the local news replayed her press conference on a loop. She stood in front of a wall of family portraits, dressed in her signature navy suit, her posture as rigid as her voice. "My son is being manipulated," she announced to the flashing cameras. "This woman, Marisol Vega, is exploiting his grief, using her child to gain access to our family name. It is disgraceful, and it will not stand." The words were daggers. By the time the broadcast ended, the damage had already spread. At Harbor Light Cafe, whispers trailed Marisol like shadows. Customers who once smiled at her now averted their eyes, or worse, leaned toward one another with that same pitying, judgmental glance she had seen too many times before. She carried plates with a trembling hand, her chest tight. By the end of the shift, she slipped into the back alley, pressing her palms to her face. She couldn't stop shaking. Her phone buzzed with messages, some friends telling her to stay strong, others warning her to leave town before things got uglier. That evening, Nathan returned to Ashford Manor, where Eleanor was waiting in the parlor. The atmosphere was suffocating. She didn't even offer him a seat. "You've shamed us," Eleanor began, her voice sharp as glass. "Do you understand what you've done to your father's legacy? To this family's name?" Nathan's jaw clenched. He stood across from her, refusing to sit, refusing to shrink. "I understand exactly what I've done. I've told the truth." "Truth?" Eleanor scoffed, stepping forward. "You call this truth? Parading around with the help, letting the whole city laugh at us? That's betrayal, Nathan. You've dragged our name into the mud for a woman who sees you as nothing more than a paycheck. He felt something snap. His voice rose, sharper than it had been since he was a boy. Do you hear yourself? You think love is a scandal. You think kindness is humiliation. But what's truly shameful isn't me loving that child. It's you, Mother. It's you teaching me to turn my back on anyone who doesn't fit into your perfect picture. Eleanor's face hardened, her fury barely contained. You dare speak to me this way? You disgrace your father's memory. Nathan took a step closer, his words steady, deliberate. The disgrace is this house. Cold, empty, obsessed with reputation while the world outside keeps living. I will not let you dictate who I can care about. For a heartbeat, there was only silence between them, the kind that feels dangerous, as though the walls themselves were listening. Then Eleanor delivered her final blow. If you insist on choosing her, then we will settle this in court. I will not watch you be ruined quietly. Marisol Vega will be exposed for what she is. I'll see her in front of a judge, stripped of every false claim, every ounce of pity she's stolen. Nathan's face went pale, but his resolve didn't falter. You drag her into court? You drag a child into this circus just to keep your pride intact. Better now than letting her bleed this family dry for years to come, Eleanor replied coldly. Marisol heard the news later that night, and her first instinct was to run. She met Nathan in the dim light of the garden, her suitcase already half-packed in her mind. I won't let her do this to you, she said quickly. If I leave now, maybe it ends here. She'll back down. Nathan grabbed her wrist before she could turn away. His eyes were burning with something she had never seen in him before, a refusal, fierce and unyielding. No, he said, his voice breaking. Not this time. If there's a storm coming, then we stand in it together. Do you know what you're saying? She whispered. She'll ruin you. She'll take everything. He held her gaze. Then let her. If I lose everything, I lose it with you. I'm done living for her rules. I'm choosing us. Marisol's throat tightened, tears welling despite her will to stay strong. She wanted to argue, to insist that she wasn't worth this sacrifice. But the look in his eyes, the steadiness she had doubted for so long, told her he had already crossed the point of no return. Lila, who had been lingering nearby, quietly slipped her hand into Nathan's free one. She didn't say a word, but the gesture alone anchored the moment. And with that, the lines were drawn. It was no longer a quiet family feud hidden behind the walls of Ashford Manor. It had spilled into the streets of Charleston, into the courtrooms, into the public's imagination. This wasn't just about inheritance or reputation anymore. It was about justice. It was about belonging. And it was about whether love had the power to survive against everything money and power could throw at it. The courthouse in downtown Charleston buzzed like a hive. Reporters crowded the front steps, microphones raised like weapons, while cameras snapped in a constant rhythm. Headlines had already splashed across the morning papers. Ashford family scandal goes to court. Inside, the air felt heavy with perfume, cologne, and the faint scent of polished wood. Rows of polished benches were filled with curious onlookers and socialites who had pulled strings to witness the spectacle. This was more than a legal proceeding. It was theater for the city's elite. Eleanor entered first, flanked by 3 attorneys in crisp suits. She moved like a queen walking into her throne room, her pearl necklace gleaming under the fluorescent lights. To those watching, she appeared dignified, composed, untouchable. But to Nathan, she looked like stone, unyielding, cold, determined to win at any cost. Marisol sat quietly at the defendant's table, hands clasped in her lap. She wore a modest navy dress, her hair pulled back. She avoided the cameras, but the strain showed in the tight set of her shoulders. Beside her, Lila clung to a small stuffed bunny she'd insisted on bringing unaware, or perhaps painfully aware, of the circus around her. Nathan sat behind them, his own lawyers ready to speak. He had agreed to let them handle it, at least at first. But as the opening arguments began, his resolve was tested. Eleanor's lead attorney rose and spoke with a polished cadence of someone who had been trained for this stage all his life. Ladies and gentlemen, We are here today to protect the legacy of the Ashford family. This is not about cruelty or coldness. It is about safeguarding what generations have built. The woman before you, Marisol Vega, has exploited Mr. Nathan Ashford's grief. She has inserted herself and her child into his household, seeking financial gain and status under the guise of compassion. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Marisol lowered her eyes, her fingers tightening against each other. Nathan's lawyer rose to object, but the judge allowed the argument to continue. The attorney pressed on, his voice slicing through the room. We intend to prove that Ms. Vega's involvement was never about kindness, but about positioning herself to benefit from the Ashford name. And it is our duty to put an end to such manipulation. Nathan felt his chest tighten, each word striking like a hammer against the fragile sense of peace he had begun to build. He looked at Marisol, at the way her back remained stiff, how she swallowed hard but refused to cry. And then he looked at Lila, sitting silently, her little hand curled around her mother's arm. Something inside him shifted. He rose to his feet before his attorney could stop him. The scrape of his chair drew every eye. A ripple of surprise passed through the courtroom. "Your Honor," Nathan said, his voice carrying across the chamber. "I need to speak." The judge frowned. "Mr. Ashford, your counsel." "With respect, Judge," Nathan interrupted gently. "This isn't about counsel. This is about me." The courtroom fell silent. Even Eleanor's lawyers paused, sensing the moment changing. Nathan turned to face the gallery, his voice steady but raw. "For years, I lived in a house that looked alive on the outside but was dead on the inside. After my daughter passed, I became a shell. I went through the motions, charity events, board meetings, dinners, but inside I was gone. I was just breathing air, not living." He looked toward Marisol and Lila, his eyes softening. "And then this child walked into my life. She didn't see me as a title or a bank account or a reputation. She saw me as someone who was hurting, and she treated me like I was worth saving. Her mother, Marisol, never once asked for anything in return. She simply cared for her daughter, and somehow, in the process, reminded me how to breathe again." He turned back toward the judge. "If you want to call that being manipulated, then fine. I'll accept that. I'll even welcome it. Because I can smile without forcing it. I can imagine a future that doesn't feel like punishment." The words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. Murmurs spread through the audience. Some scoffed, others whispered their agreement, and a few even dabbed their eyes with tissues. Eleanor's face darkened, her jaw tight with fury. She leaned forward, her voice dripping venom. "You shame us all, Nathan. You shame your father's memory. To stand here and praise a servant for saving you. Do you hear how pathetic you sound?" Nathan turned to her, his expression calm but resolute. "No, Mother. What's pathetic is thinking love is something to be ashamed of." The courtroom stirred again, voices overlapping in a mix of outrage and admiration. The judge called for order, but the echo of Nathan's words lingered. The session ended with no verdict, just a postponement. The judge declared more evidence would be needed, and the gavel struck with a sharp finality. Yet the air leaving the room carried something irreversible. It was no longer a private feud within the Ashford family. It was a war fought in the open, before the city, with sides already forming. As Nathan walked out, Marisol looked at him with tears that blurred the line between fear and gratitude. He didn't speak, but his hand brushed lightly against hers, a promise unspoken. Behind them, Eleanor rose from her seat, her face carved with betrayal. The bond between mother and son had been cracked before. Now it had shattered. The courthouse was still buzzing from the last session when Eleanor called for a recess to speak privately with her son. They met in a side chamber, away from the eyes of the press, though everyone knew whispers would spread before the day was done. The room smelled faintly of varnished wood and stale air, the kind of space meant for business, not heartache. Eleanor stood with her back straight, arms folded, her pearls gleaming against her black dress. She looked more like a statue than a mother. Nathan stood across from her, his hands loosely at his sides, as though he had already resigned himself to what was coming. Eleanor's voice was sharp, clipped. You leave me no choice, Nathan. If you continue down this path, you will be erased. Do you understand? No inheritance. No properties. No stake in Ashford Enterprises. And if you insist on tying yourself to that woman and her child, you will cease to exist in this family. You will not even bear our name. Her words cut with the precision of a blade. There was no tremor, no hesitation. It was not a threat, it was a sentence. Nathan stared at her, the weight of decades pressing down on him. For years he had lived under her rules, molded into her vision of what an Ashford should be. He had given speeches at her insistence, shaken hands with men he didn't respect, smiled at galas while grieving quietly inside. He had played his role, even when it hollowed him out. And yet, in this moment, looking at her, the woman who had raised him with discipline but never warmth, he realized something. Her power was only as strong as his willingness to obey. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the legal papers his attorney had prepared. His hand did not shake. He laid them on the table between them, the pen scratching across the page in a single, steady line. The silence was deafening. When he finished, he slid the papers toward her. His voice was quiet, almost gentle, but resolute. If the Ashford name means living in a house where love is forbidden, then I want no part of it. If it means pride without compassion, legacy without heart, then I don't need it. Not anymore. Eleanor blinked, stunned. The composure slipped, just for a heartbeat. She looked at the papers, then at her son, as though she no longer recognized him. You would throw away everything your father built? Nathan met her gaze, his eyes steady. What my father built died with him. What I want to build is something you'll never understand. She opened her mouth, but no words came. For once, Eleanor Ashford, the woman who had commanded boardrooms and silenced entire halls, stood speechless. The door creaked as it opened, and Marisol appeared, hesitant, as though afraid she was intruding. Her eyes widened when she saw the signed document. Nathan, what did you do? He turned toward her, a faint, almost tired smile tugging at his lips. I did what I should have done years ago. Marisol shook her head, her voice breaking. You gave up everything. For me. For us. He stepped closer, resting a hand lightly against her arm. I didn't give up anything. I finally chose something worth keeping. Then came the sound of footsteps, fast, uneven, before Lila appeared, clutching her stuffed bunny in one hand. She looked at the papers, then at Nathan, then at her grandmother's rigid figure. Her small voice carried more weight than the lawyers, the press, or the court itself. Does this mean you're staying with us? Nathan bent down, scooping her into his arms. He held her close, feeling her tiny heartbeat against his chest. Yes, sweetheart. It means I'm staying. And with that, he walked out of the chamber, past the stunned reporters who had gathered at the courthouse doors, past the flashing cameras that tried to capture every angle of the moment, past the murmurs of society ladies and the sharp questions of men who measured worth by wealth. The image that spread across Charleston that evening was not of Eleanor Ashford presiding like a queen, nor of polished attorneys making their arguments. It was of Nathan Ashford, once heir to a fortune, walking down the courthouse steps with a child in his arms and a woman at his side. The cameras caught the way Lila's little hand clung to his collar, the way Marisol looked at him with disbelief and fierce tenderness, the way he seemed lighter than he had in years. A man who had walked into that building, shackled by legacy, walked out free. The morning after the courthouse erupted in whispers and headlines, Nathan packed the last of his belongings into the trunk of a rented sedan. The Ashford crest no longer adorned his life, not on the silverware, not on the doorframes, not in the heavy drapery that once cast shadows over every room. He left Ashford Manor behind without turning back. Marisol stood beside him, her hand resting protectively on Lila's shoulder, and together the three of them drove toward the edge of Charleston, past the harbor breeze, until they found a modest little house tucked near Waterfront Park. It was no estate, 2 bedrooms, a creaky porch, and walls that carried the scent of old paint and pine cleaner. But it was theirs, and when Nathan placed the key into Marisol's hand, she smiled in a way that made the house feel alive. For the first time in decades, Nathan was no longer Mr. Ashford, heir to a dynasty. He was simply a man trying to learn ordinary things. On Saturday mornings, he found himself at the local farmer's market, haggling clumsily over tomatoes with vendors who didn't bow or whisper his name. In the afternoons, he drove Lila to school, waiting in the pickup line like every other parent. In the evenings, he helped Marisol sweep the porch or fold laundry, his hands clumsy but steady, his heart oddly at peace. At night, when silence stretched across the small house, he wrestled with himself. He had traded away a fortune, a lineage centuries old. The Ashford name was no longer his shield. But when he looked across the hallway and saw Lila's drawings taped crookedly to her bedroom door, or when he heard her laughter echo in the kitchen, the weight of what he had lost seemed insignificant. It dawned on him that his true fear had never been poverty or shame. It was losing another child. That terror, raw, unshakable, had haunted him since the day he buried his daughter. Now, with Lila's hand in his, he understood that wealth could not protect him from grief, but love could give him the courage to face it. The world beyond their little house buzzed with opinions. Newspapers first mocked him, calling him the Ashford who walked away. But as weeks passed, the tone shifted. Some articles began to tell his story with a touch of sympathy. The millionaire who chose family over fortune. One headline read. Radio callers debated his decision. Some branded it foolish, others praised it as brave. In church bulletins, his name appeared as an example of sacrifice. Slowly, the tide of judgment began to soften. Then one quiet afternoon, Eleanor came. She arrived without her entourage, no lawyers, no chauffeur, no glittering pearls to armor her. She stood at the foot of the small front porch, her posture still regal, but her face lined with exhaustion. Nathan opened the door, Lila's hand tucked inside his, while Marisol watched from the living room. For a long moment, mother and son simply looked at each other. Years of unspoken battles seemed to hover in the air. Finally, Eleanor's voice cut through the stillness, low and bitter, but not sharp. You made your choice, Nathan. You abandoned everything your father and I fought to preserve. I will not forgive you for that. Her gaze flicked briefly to Lila, then back to her son. Something in her eyes softened, though her mouth never did. But I see why you did it. And that, I can't deny. It was the closest she had ever come to admitting defeat. Nathan felt no triumph, only a deep ache. He wanted to reach for her, to ask if there was still a way back, but the words caught in his throat. She turned before he could try, her footsteps heavy against the sidewalk, retreating into the same solitude that had ruled her life for decades. He watched until her figure disappeared down the street. The finality of it struck him, not the loss of wealth, but the severing of blood. Yet when he turned back inside, Lila ran to him with a drawing in her hands, proudly announcing, I made this for our new living room. The picture was crooked houses under a yellow sun, 3 stick figures holding hands. Marisol met his eyes, her voice barely above a whisper. We'll be okay, Nathan. Better than okay. He nodded, pulling them both close. Outside, Charleston carried on, cars honking, gulls circling the water, vendors shouting by the market. The Ashford name might fade from the city's lips, but in the warmth of that little house, Nathan had found something greater. Charleston, in the fall, carried a gentler kind of light. The summer heat had softened, and the breeze along the harbor carried hints of salt and leaves turning gold. Waterfront Park was alive with laughter and footsteps on the wooden boardwalk, the steady rhythm of waves lapping against the shore. Nathan walked slowly between Marisol and Lila, their steps unhurried, their silence comfortable. Lila ran ahead toward the fountains, her laughter scattering into the air like bird song. She chased the arcs of water as they leapt and fell, her shoes splashing through puddles, her face lit with the kind of joy Nathan had once believed he would never see again. That sound, the laugh of a child, untied knots inside him he hadn't even known were there. Marisol paused to watch her daughter, her dark hair brushing against her shoulders in the breeze. Then she turned to Nathan. Her eyes carried no hesitation, no guarded walls. She simply looked at him steady and open. "You're different," she said softly. Nathan almost laughed at the understatement. "I feel different," he admitted, his voice quiet but certain. "Not lighter, not yet, but whole, somehow." Marisol smiled, and it wasn't cautious anymore. It was the kind of smile that let him know she believed in what they were building together. Nathan returned it, his own smile awkward at first, then firm, like a man relearning how to stand on steady ground. They found a bench beneath an oak tree, and as they sat, the world seemed smaller, safer. The harbor shimmered in the distance, and gulls swept through the fading sky. Lila darted back and forth between the fountains and the bench, showing them each little discovery. Wet leaves, coins at the bottom of the water, a butterfly that landed near her hand. Nathan leaned back, breathing in the crisp air, and felt a strange peace settle over him. He had no mansion, no legacy carved in stone, but the sight of Marisol's calm expression and Lila's carefree joy filled the empty places his fortune never could. As the afternoon slipped toward dusk, the mailman strolled by the park entrance, handing out envelopes to families scattered on benches. Nathan took a small stack, flipping through until his eyes caught a letter with an unfamiliar seal. He opened it carefully, scanning the words. It was an invitation from a local nonprofit working to establish a community center for children without stable homes. They wanted him to serve on the founding committee, to help guide the project and share his resources. The letter spoke of giving children a safe place to belong, of building something not for profit, but for healing. Nathan smiled to himself, the corner of his mouth curving, as if he had just been reminded of a promise. He tucked the letter into his jacket, already knowing the answer. His story with Lila and Marisol had taught him that love could reroot itself in unexpected soil, and perhaps now it was time to make that truth wider than their little family. Marisol noticed his expression. "Good news." "The start of something," Nathan replied, his eyes following Lila's small figure darting in the distance. "Maybe the real beginning." Marisol didn't press him further. She only rested her hand lightly on his arm, a gesture that said she trusted whatever path he was considering. Nathan felt no weight of expectation pressing on his chest, only possibility. The sun began to dip low, painting the water in streaks of orange and rose. Lila spun in the spray of the fountains, her laughter mingling with the hush of waves. Nathan leaned forward, elbows on his knees, watching her. His voice was barely more than a whisper, meant only for himself, though Marisol heard it too. "My girl," he murmured, his throat tight. "This time, I won't lose you." The words trembled in the air, but they held no fear, only a vow, quiet but unbreakable. As twilight folded over Charleston, the three of them lingered on the bench. They were not polished, not perfect. They carried scars, uncertainties, and a future without guarantees. But in that moment, they were complete. A family not by blood or inheritance, but by the courage of choosing to stay. The scene closed on their silhouettes, Nathan, Marisol, and Lila, framed against the glowing horizon. The grandeur of Ashford Manor was gone, but in its place stood something greater, the simple, enduring strength of love that chooses, again and again, to remain. At the end of the day, this story isn't about wealth, titles, or the walls of a grand estate. It's about the choice to stay when it's easier to walk away, the courage to love even when the world says you shouldn't, and the truth that family is built on presence, not bloodlines. Maybe the real question is, in your own life, who have you chosen to stay for? If this story touched you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. There are many more stories waiting for you.